Everybody, welcome to day 2 for hearing stream 2, hearing of submissions on the proposed Napier City District Plan. Hearing stream 2 covers the topics of subdivision, coastal environment, earthworks, light, signs, temporary activities, natural features and landscapes. And today is dedicated to hearing of submitters, and very shortly we'll hear from our first submitter. Just before I do that, can I just remind people to turn their phones on silent or off, please? Great. So we've got Angela McFlynn here. Welcome again. I think you'll be a familiar face by the time we finish the hearing, so thank you.
Yes,
you've pre-circulated your evidence, and which we've read. Thank you very much. And so the floor is yours in terms of talking to it this morning.
Thank you. Yes, my name is Angela McFlynn. I'm Director of McFlynn Surveying Limited. Hopefully you remember me from last time.
It's quite quiet, is that?
That's probably me. I am very quiet, sorry.
That's all right.
Just to start off with, there was actually one point which I realised as I was going through this this morning that I didn't include in my written statement, and I didn't actually have a chance to look up what the actual standard was, but it was in relation to public access routes. And I had in my submission requested that some kind of guidance be included around compensation for those public access routes. The reporting officer said that because these weren't esplanade reserves or esplanade strips, that the council didn't have to compensate for them. Mm-hmm. Just think it's worth noting that that would actually be considered a financial contribution, as being a contribution of land or money. And I think that it's important that all developers contribute the same proportion of financial contributions, and that should be reflected in the plan. The council, I would expect, have done an exercise of establishing the value of all the reserve land that they require, including those access strips, or access routes, sorry, and then apportioned that value across all other developers. And it's just my personal opinion that it's unfair to require more of a contribution from someone who happens to own land that an access route is passing through. If that value of that land is more than they would have had to pay for their reserves contribution, then there shall be some recognition of that and a refund from the money that council have collected from other people for that purpose.
Thank you.
In terms of the other points, I did have the benefit of being able to listen in on some of the other submissions yesterday. So I'll just kind of limit my comments to things that other people have already addressed in relation to my submissions, with one exception being the natural features and landscapes. I did provide a suggestion of what I think is a slightly clearer wording for the rules around the colours and materials used in buildings. This I've stolen from Waipa District Plan. They have the benefit of having had a special landscape character area for, I think, probably 20 years now, and they've refined and improved their rules around those colours and materials over that time. So I think where they're at now with those rules would make a good starting point, and just provides a little bit more clarity around what would be acceptable. So it's not up to a individual consents planner to go, oh, well, is that colour similar, is the colour of that timber similar to the colours in there, and if not, does it require resource consent? So that was the reasoning behind that, just to make everyone's life easier, really. Not suggesting by any means that rule as they've written it is perfect. I haven't actually had to work with that rule as it is now, but I think it provides a good starting point. Right. The next point I'd just like to touch on is around the boundary adjustments with the 10% criteria. it's just, to me, seems quite arbitrary and unnecessary. I think the other standards within that boundary adjustments rule will provide enough direction for boundary adjustments to make sure that they're appropriate. 10% is, as I said, quite arbitrary, and depending on the size of the properties involved is a very different number. And I provided a couple of examples of what would be allowed based on the actual title size. So I think there was one situation where, of the examples I provided, where you could transfer almost 8,000 square metres, and that's a minor boundary adjustment, but for the property right next door to it, you could only transfer 500 square metres. So, like, just doesn't seem that the 10% is necessary, in my opinion. Right. The next point was standard sub S8 with the requirement that details be provided of the extent and quantum of earthworks required to create a building platform and access. I did listen into what was discussed about this yesterday, and agree with most of what Ms. Francis said, with one exception. I just about jumped out of my chair when she said that if you do expect the platform to be formed as part of the subdivision, that's okay. I don't agree that it would be a good outcome for anyone to require not only the detail of the earthworks to be provided, but also the actual formation of those building platforms, especially on those like really sloping sites, like the example that I provided within my submission. Those people, the new owners of that site, were originally looking at a nice flat building platform on which to put their house, and then they started talking to a designer, and the designer said, actually, that's not a good idea. What you need to be doing is working with the landscape and minimising the amount of earthworks that you have to do, and actually designing to work with that. And if those building platforms have to be formed as part of the subdivision, then you're losing that opportunity to actually respect the landscape, work with it, and minimise the impact of that development. But more importantly, I don't agree that it's necessary to provide that level of detail at subdivision stage. We always, when applying for a subdivision consent, identify a potential building platform, and in situations where there would likely be some earthworks required to form that, there will be a geotechnical report accompanying that application, which will confirm that the land is suitable and what measures would have to be undertaken when you did do those earthworks. But most of the time, that's one randomly selected potential building platform. And in my experience, most of the lifestyle site subdivisions in those areas are vacant lot subdivisions sold to other people who have their own ideas about where they want to build. And it's typically not what looks the easiest on paper to get the subdivision consent across the line. So I just feel that it's unnecessary expense when a geotech report can give the certainty that the land is capable of being developed. Those reports often also address stormwater and effluent disposal, confirming that those can also be accommodated within the site. And the actual detail is best left to when it's actually built on, giving that flexibility to work with the landform rather than against it to create a flat building platform when one isn't actually necessary. And the final point I wanted to touch on was the cross-lease conversions, and fully agree with everything that Mr. Pankhurst said on that matter yesterday. Cross-lease, it's all existing, established occupation, is most of the time clearly defined exclusive use areas and common areas. Nothing is actually changing. I did see Mr. Thorpe gave a lovely picture showing the stormwater situation, which was quite eye-opening, but making it really hard to do cross-lease conversions isn't going to help that situation at all. Cross leases, it's already quite an expensive exercise to convert a cross lease to a freehold section. The value gain for the people that are doing it is minimal. Adding an extra cost of stormwater management is just going to stop it from happening. No one's going to win from that situation. The costs are going to far outweigh the benefits. So, yeah, any questions?
Thank you very much. You didn't talk to your point around the stormwater issue in terms of Greenfield subdivision. I was just going to ask you a question around that. That I could see some reasoning why the issue of stormwater at the subdivision stage is a relevant matter to consider. So you said in your evidence that that it would provide sort of all potential impervious surfaces and buildings to sort of be determined at subdivision consent, but would it really? Wouldn't it just be a question of sort of maybe, as you said, in terms of building platforms, just a theoretical kind of level of stormwater generation, and not necessarily pin it down to covering all contingencies?
In which case, we'd probably, with every subdivision application, say we can put in detention tanks.
Yeah.
But that's best left to the building design. I don't see the benefit in trying to pin down how stormwater is going to be disposed of when you don't know where the house is going to be, how big it's going to be, where the hard surfaces will be, and the whole stormwater design is dependent on all of that information.
Right. So you don't think stormwater should be addressed at the subdivision stage at all?
I think it's the site coverage standards that should be ensuring that a 350 square metre site, if that's the minimum lot size, then that should be generally accepted to be able to accommodate stormwater from a building of the size provided for and the hard surfaces that are allowed. But the detail of how that's going to be done can't be provided in any meaningful way until you've got a building design and a site layout.
Okay, thank you. And my other question relates to the building platform issue as well. I think one idea, I believe, is it for the subdivision, at the subdivision consent stage, is to wrap up the issue of earthworks at the same time. So it's kind of a efficiency question as well, trying to deal with both at the same time in terms of benefits down the track, that you don't then reapply for land use consent down the track. But are you saying that there should be options, that you could go that way, or you could leave it to a future land use or land owner to sort that out?
Again, the actual earthworks that will be required will be dependent on where the actual house is and the size and shape, and if they wanted to do build a split level house using the landscape, and you can't predetermine that. A lot of the time you don't even know who's going to be building on it. On occasions it will be someone creating a site to build on themselves, but not very often. So yeah, it's a lot of money and expense to come up with a theoretical earthworks design for a theoretical building platform that's probably never going to be used.
Is there any benefit for the subdivider at that stage for sorting out the building platform stage before the lots go on the market?
Only if they happen to identify the platform that the future owner wants to use. And when there's multiple options, and people have their own preferences, my husband and I probably wouldn't agree on where we should put a house on a site. So how can a subdivider guess where a future owner is going to want one?
Okay, thank you. Any questions from the panel?
So just go back to that one, this wasn't going to be my question, but I guess the idea is that as long as there is one or more suitable building platform sites identified at subdivision stage, that would, I'm thinking, satisfy council that it's able to be built on. And yeah, we've had some discussion, as you alluded to, you probably watched some of it yesterday, around S8. So I think we've got a little bit more thinking to do about that. My question's really around the visually prominent areas, and that's referenced in policy 4 in the subdivision, and you noted that it hadn't been addressed in the officer's report, probably just accidentally, I'm sure. Yeah, I'm also interested to know, how that would be determined, what a visually prominent area would be. So I'm not sure, Connie, if you've got some comment on that.
Yeah, I do have some comment, and I'm sorry it was missed out of the report. I did the thinking, and obviously my editing cut accident way. I was of the opinion it didn't need to be defined because it was a policy framework, in the way that that policy would be interrelated or would become of relevance is when you've got a non-compliance with a standard. And it turned my mind to more the outstanding natural features landscape. If you're subdividing over those ridge lines. So I think there is opportunity to tidy that up, but I didn't think it needed to be defined because it would create a very narrow focus. But I'm happy to take any thoughts on it as well.
Thanks. Thank you. So, I mean, you said too, Angela, that you're unable to provide a suggested wording. I mean, maybe it's something that we could look at getting a few people to have a think about, not necessarily defining those areas, but providing a definition of how it would be, something like that would be determined. Thank you.
No questions? Okay. Thank you very much, Ms McFlynn, for your time.
Thank
Much
you.
appreciated. Thank you.
See you next time.
Next year. Okay, we have Mr. Jury next. Wearing two hats this morning. The first hat is for Emerald Hills Joint Venture. Yep. Correct? And we've read your pre-circulated evidence and summary of evidence, so thank you very much. The floor is yours to talk to.
Okay, thank you. Good morning.
Marina.
Good morning.
Okay, so recognising that you've read everything, I guess I had 5 key points with the Emerald Hills evidence. The first one, which is potentially the primary one, was the submission for the reduced minimum net site area within the rural residential precinct. And you'll recall from reading that the key reasons there was recognising the area's locational advantage to the urban fringe of Napier. Looking at the other zones, the large residential zone and the dual voice town zone, I felt that the location and the circumstances in terms of good access to a residential environment, being the adjoining residential precinct within that mission area, presented opportunity for that area to be considered in the same way. Looking into the objectives and policies, it was very much looking to balance out, I guess, the opportunity for residential development as well as preserving farming. In my view, given that the land concerned is LUC6, rolling and very close to residential environments, my thoughts was that the land actually presents greater opportunity to manage urban growth and to provide opportunity to Napier's residents for a choice of housing. So in summary, I felt there was capacity, there was justification, leaning into existing planning frameworks to look at amendments, and I've presented what those amendments could look like, recognising that the concerns around wastewater servicing in particular can be addressed through frameworks already embedded within the district plan. I guess before I move on to the next topic, any questions, or how would you like to do questions? I should have asked at the beginning.
Well, if you could talk through your statement first, and then we'll...
Yep, sure. So the second point there was with standard subs S7 and how that looks to integrate provisions contained in Dev 3 into the subdivision chapter. My point there is that there are no rules or standards in Dev 3, so I just found it unnecessary to create that sort of confusion, so to speak. And that kind of also relates to, I guess, the next 2 points in terms of saying that the provisions S13 and 17 pertaining to stormwater indicative public access routes, I don't consider they needed to be applying to the mission area either. The reason for that is because those very matters are already well canvassed in other provisions. In terms of stormwater in particular, there's already a stormwater discharge permit in place. There's already provisions in the plan relating to development within the mission area to comply with that consent as a standard. And essentially, we were just creating 2 different directions, essentially, which I thought was going to be troublesome. And in terms of the indicative public access routes, in the structure plan, there are already pathways indicated. And so again, that was just creating confusion and unnecessary change. It was almost as if the structure plan itself was looking at being reviewed, which I didn't think was appropriate. So I thought it was quite simple just to lean into the existing structure plan and planning framework around that area, rather than introducing another kind of concurrent planning framework. Likewise, having subdivision within the mission development area subject to the assessment criteria in the subdivision chapter, as well as the assessment criteria in all the other more specific chapters pertaining to development within the zone. I just saw that as again, duplication and quite a lot of matters to consider, which I just thought was unnecessary. Now, I do recognise that in her opening statement, the officer did acknowledge that we had been in contact around those sorts of matters. I think there's a level of agreement that development within structure plan areas should be implemented according to the structure plans, and not necessarily the generic subdivision provisions pertaining to the entire city. But there are still some challenges just to work out the wording as to how to apply the development areas and structure planning provisions to, I guess, a first instance subdivision, and then what triggers the more generic provisions in the subdivision chapter to be applied to future or second instance subdivisions. So happy to continue to work with the officer to try to resolve that, and to answer any questions and take your guidance. And then really the last matter was probably more of a minor one really, and that was just in regard to assessment criteria C pertaining to how cul-de-sacs are considered. I think we've all had experiences where there's been unanticipated or poor outcomes associated with cul-de-sacs, and I certainly support the approach in the district plan to try to provide some guidance around that. But I just felt that the wording, the current wording was just a little bit too prohibitive, and it would be difficult, I thought, to to support, short cul-de-sacs, which are often favoured by the community. This is often the challenge. If you talk to a developer, they'll say that the sections in the cul-de-sacs are the first to go. So it's really just managing, that community expectation and balancing out good urban design, which I felt the amendments that I presented still provided for that. So yeah, those were the key points of Emerald Hills in relation to the subdivision chapter.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jury. As you'd appreciate, we have yet to hear submissions on zones and including development areas and things.
Correct. Yep.
And I would just say as an aside, relating to relatively recent experience I've had with development areas, one of the issues is how to transition from a development area structure plan process to full zoning, and understanding that when you get down to the detailed design of subdivision and earthworks and things, that it may not perfectly fit the structure plan in terms of boundaries and extents. And
Absolutely.
things like that.
Yep.
So some of the issues around whether there should be some sort of recognition or provision for some sort of wriggle room around that process to sort of allow for it being put in the ground, so to speak. Okay, that's just a side point. Just the Mission Rural Residential Precinct, which you refer to in paragraph 6.4, in the end, what kind of zone will that be? Will it be a rural lifestyle or a large lot residential?
In the current plan or along the lines that I'm suggesting?
Well, both.
Both. So in the plan as notified, it would be, I guess, similar to the Priority area, which is relatively low density, versus something, I guess, if you can imagine Jervois Town on rolling hills. So I'm just suggesting that there's capacity to accommodate more housing right on the periphery of Napier, on hills, which will be more free of natural hazards. I think one of Napier's biggest challenges is actually, enabling retreat to the hills. And I think that this area presents a very easy opportunity. So that's why I believe it should be taken.
Because 1,000 square metre sort of minimum sounds like a sort of large lot residential zone.
Yes, I think if the generic 1,000 metres was followed, then you would get something like the Kent Terrace environment, which is the large residential. But recognising that it still has topography, lot layout would probably result in something, not every single lot, 1,000 squares, I would imagine. So yeah, I guess if you're thinking Kent Terrace is probably something that you'd look to envisage.
Replicating. Okay, thank you. Minor question. In your section 32 on page 7, you talk about, and this is the option 1 to retain the existing 5,000 square metres. That's on page 7.
Yes.
In the first row, under costs, you say, risk the efficient use of land. So I'm reading that it's sort of the opposite. It would risk land being developed inefficiently. Is that how I should read it?
Yes. So what I'm saying there is that looking in terms of what the objectives and policies are looking to, how they support the 5,000 is to say that it should be preserved for farming and hobbies and so on. I'm noting that the land is LUC 6, so really should it be preserved for that? And again, with those locational advantages and everything going for it and Napier's challenges, I'm thinking the better use of that land is to enable residential development.
Okay, thank you. And just one other question before I turn to the panel. Thought I did. That's it then. Any questions for Mr. Jury?
Thank you, Mr. Jury, for the submission. I was just looking in regards to sub 13, the low impact stormwater. I was reading the officer's recommendation in there, and that they consider it still to be relevant and a relevant, appropriate standard within the mission development area. And I'm trying to reconcile that with your additional evidence. Are you able to talk me through that? You believe that direction is already contained in Dev 3?
Yeah,
so on.
the resource consent, the approved consent from Hawke's Bay Regional Council essentially has within it design outcomes around water quantity and quality. So when you're talking low impact solutions, it's already embodied in that consent. It's that consent from the Regional Council that produces the treatment swales, the attenuation, and so on. Then when you turn to the district plan within a provision, in order for subdivision within that zone to be classified as a restricted discretionary activity, I think it has to comply with that discharge permit. So that's the connection to achieve low impact solutions. So my submission is that we don't need to bring in another planning framework that drives towards low impact solutions when we've already got one. In some respects, I haven't looked into it, but the risk is that there's actually conflict between the district plan and the regional council consent. and then suddenly we're going back 10 years and reinventing, having to change that discharge permit. And I just consider that there is no outcome there when we've already got a consent process that achieves the outcomes being sought.
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chair. I think that would be something I'd be really interested in you and the officers working on some wording potentially on.
Yep.
Yeah, there seems to be quite a difference of opinion there, and I think it would be good if, as part of the officer's reply, we could work on that. Thank you.
Can also provide a copy of that regional council consent as well, if you'd like.
Yeah, thank you. And just a comment to staff, I think I'm particularly interested in, obviously the regional council consenting framework doesn't need to give regard necessarily to the district plan recommendation. So what is our risk of future developments being inconsistent? And so what does that look like?
I'll note it down.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Drury. I always had a question really around more around your comment around that the stormwater and access routes and so forth are already, well canvassed. So I just really wanted to understand, because I'm really, apart from flying over it and driving past it, I'm really unfamiliar with any of the requirements around that whole area. And just want to understand, so the structure plan and I guess the associated identified servicing were based around 5,000 square metre minimum site area, would that be right?
So the servicing solutions, well, the district plan, the current structure plan has the residential precinct, which had an indicative yield. And at the time of the structure plan, there were, I guess, indicative servicing plans provided. But just as the point was made, once you pick up that structure plan and look to actually implement it, there are changes.
Yep.
So the servicing solution that's been presented for the first two subdivisions, bearing in mind that I think the first subdivision was for 180 lots, which has been approved. That's sort of North Hill. And then there's another subdivision in place now. There's an overall servicing design and roading design that looks to provide for, I think future-proofing like 1,200 sites.
Okay.
And so the wastewater servicing solution, for example, differs from what was anticipated in the structure plan. There's actually low pressure systems discharging into a main which drops down to penotage, whereas the structure plan anticipated full gravity. The stormwater solutions are essentially as outlined in the stormwater discharge permit, which was obtained concurrent with the structure plan to demonstrate or to provide for stormwater servicing. And then water supply is essentially as anticipated. So there would be capacity within the design to accommodate a greater density of development in the remaining rural residential precinct. And any application put forward would need to validate itself against that servicing capacity.
Yep. Good. Thanks very much.
Just on that point, should a more dense development in that precinct occur, may it trigger the need for either a variation or a new discharge consent from the regional council, do you think?
Yes, it probably would. Yeah. The discharge permit applies to the full 246 hectare area of the site, but you're probably right. It probably would do, and in that regard, depending on lot size, you could either look at on-site solutions, or alternatively, you could look at developing a treatment swale and attenuation pond in the exact same manner as the adjoining gullies. So, and I guess there would be a high level of confidence with that, given that the environment is essentially the same. A discharge permit has already been granted, and you'll just be following that design direction.
Okay, and just to follow up, there's that question of what would be the harm. So if it's likely that a new discharge consents required from the regional council, what would be the harm in addressing standard 13, S13 matters at that same time concurrently?
I think they're two separate matters. I think that the provisions relating to stormwater around seeking low impact solutions for the Mission Hills area, as already included in those development area provisions and in the existing structure plan, would probably take you down the same pathway to achieving low impact solutions in the same way as what were approved for the residential zone, without having to lean back into the new ones coming forward. And I also make the comment that I guess you don't, the fact that there was a discharge permit approved alongside the structure plan at the time was very helpful, but not ultimately necessary. So I think if you were of a mind to enable the opportunity for residential uptake in that rural residential area, having a discharge permit on hand would not be absolutely necessary.
Right.
There's certainly guidance in the structure plan and in the development areas and just what would be expected to drive towards those sorts of outcomes. Once the development sequence actually got around to developing that area, because we are talking some years off, just with the efficient rollout of access and so on. It would probably be the last area of development, which is planned to be a 10-year process in itself.
Because I asked that because I'm slightly influenced by some tabled evidence yesterday from Napier City's infrastructure team, which included, I don't know if you've had a chance to see it or not, the stormwater pipeline capacity map,
Okay.
which shows most of the city is either 100% or probably more than that, is at 200% capacity, including the area sort of near the Mission area.
So the Mission Hill solution's all drain westwards. So in some respects, providing for development, as I'm suggesting, would be a response to that issue,
Yeah,
as opposed to loading up that issue even more.
yeah. I think that my point is that the city has a very direct interest in stormwater discharge.
Yes, absolutely.
And how it will affect the infrastructure. Thank you. Any further questions, Mr. Drew?
Through you, Mr. Chair, just double checking that we do have on the staff's radar that offer to continue working on the wording where there is a structure plan and what those triggers might look like if we were to be persuaded around that point. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Jury. You want a moment to swap hats, and we'll move on to your evidence too. Talking of Napier City Council submissions. So this is on behalf of Napier City Council Events Management.
Correct. Yeah.
So again, we have read your pre-circulated summary and full statement of evidence, so thank you for that. Again, if you'd like to talk to the main points.
Okay, so only 4 points this time. And these points mainly actually relate to Napier City's interest in enabling the Church Road winery site. So a bit of background there is that the event manager, is very involved with attracting and facilitating events on sites beyond just Napier City. And that represents the interest in facilitating events for the city to create vibrancy, tourism opportunities, and to essentially enable the economy. So I just thought I'd provide that background because it might just seem a bit strange that we're making submissions primarily on a private site. But the first point here is really focusing on the erection of temporary buildings and structures being stages. So there's actually been a couple of circumstances with the Church Road winery site where resource consent has been needed for a stage. Now that consent, the event organisers have realised that very late in the piece. We've had to prepare and rush through consent applications. And my own reflection on that was that really that cost and that extra matter to consider for event organisers is just unnecessary. My view there is that there is a yard setback. At the time of making this submission, I wrongfully assumed that there was also a height in relation to boundary setback. You see my evidence that I've identified that and presented a solution there, because the key point is that if a stage complies with the yard setback and if it complies with the height in relation to boundary, you are avoiding effects of shading. You're not generating any issue with privacy. You are by default creating quite a large setback to avoid any issues with built domination, all in the context that these are temporary stages. So in my view, I don't see the need for a height limitation. And I think it is at odds with the fact that the temporary event framework is trying to enable and avoid regulatory barriers. And it's almost as if a stage needs a consent, then the whole framework is kind of compromised, because the whole idea is to try to avoid the need for regulatory approvals where appropriate. So in my evidence, as you know, I've set out a framework where I believe the relief sought can be achieved without any effects on adjoining parties and so on, recognising the temporary nature of any such activity. The second point there was again just recognising the temporary nature of these events and some of the logistics with them in regard to still sort of requiring light if possible to sort of pack down and pack up. Often with these events, it's all about managing your labour resource. If you've got everyone on site, then it's best to clean up as quick as you can rather than bringing everyone back the next day. It just adds to significant cost. So my view there is that if one of the 5 temporary events is being held on the site, then there is light spill, or the period where the light spill limitations come into play could be extended to 12 o'clock. The last 2 points in my one-page summary really, they refer more back to the stadium zone. And I recognise that the stadium zone hasn't been considered in a hearing yet, and also recognise that the officer has also reached out to discuss some of the matters raised. Because fundamentally, I just think that the relationship between the stadium zone and the temporary events chapter has just not been quite refined. And I say here that one implication of what has been put forward is that I feel that the number of events that McLean Park could host could be reduced, which I think is not what's intended for the city's primary facility. And so I've sort of made the suggestion there that decisions around those matters could probably be held off until we've heard the stadium zone. And I'm pleased that the office has picked up on that and has reached out.
Thank you, Mr. Jury. Any questions?
Thank you very much. A lot of that makes an awful lot of sense, but I just have one question, and it's just, now I've got to find it, sorry, back on your evidence. It was around that height in relation to boundary, and you've got a suggested additional clause in there around, it's in your paragraph 13 4B, where the site abuts an entrance strip, etc., the furthest boundary of the entrance strip, etc., may be deemed to be the site boundary. So can you just explain to me, Church Road, winery, stage in its normal place, where's the furthest boundary?
The furthest boundary would be the residential boundary to the...
South? East?
I was going to say west.
West,
Yeah.
west, south, yeah.
Yeah, because you've got the Church Road site,
Yeah,
and then if the hills are here,
yeah,
you've got Church Road, then you've got a small open space zone where the pathway goes through, and then there's the residential boundaries.
Okay.
So it would be that one there.
okay. Thank you. So it's, yeah,
So in that case, it's added distance.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. No, I have no other questions, thank you.
Okay.
No, it's
No,
clear.
no.
Thank you.
I don't have any further questions too. So thank you very much, Mr. Jury, for your double act today. Much appreciated. Our next submitter to attend in person from Hawke's Bay Airport Limited, so please make your way to the table. And we have Alan Rowbotham and Gavin Carey-Smith, is that correct? Yes. So we have read your pre-circulated planning evidence, thank you very much. The two appendices went with it. And no doubt, I'll just preface it by saying, as you say in your evidence, that this will all be revisited later down the track when we look at the zoning issue for the airport as well. So thank you very much for that information ahead of time. Well, it's not ahead of time, I suppose, in terms of that chapter we're looking at today, but it's, yeah, it's good to know that stuff. So I will say, I'll just say that I'm sort of vaguely familiar, having driven up State Highway 2 many, many times, but I will want to have a fresh look at the particular view shafts proposed and things like that, probably early in the new year.
Yes, yep. Cool, thank you. Kia ora koutou, everybody. As you've just said, my name's Alan Robotham. I'm consultant planner from Mitchell Dash, here on behalf of Hawke's Bay Airport, and I have with me Gavin Carey-Smith from the airport. As you've noted, we have submitted a brief of planning evidence, but this time we haven't submitted corporate evidence, just given the fact that we supplied quite a comprehensive corporate evidence brief for hearing stream 1. But Gavin's here today to ask any questions you might have that are directed more to the airport or that corporate side of things as opposed to the planning side of things. Exactly as you've noted, the brief of evidence that I've supplied today is relatively short and high level, and the reason for that is being that most of the airport's kind of substantive matters are covered by either the airport zone or the airport's designations, and so we anticipate those matters to be considered more in depth at those hearings. And yeah, the point of appearing here today is just to make sure that we're being able to look at the plan in a whole of plan context and, as you say, raise those potential conflicts early, just so you can keep them in mind. And so in terms of the matters that I raised in my planning evidence that you've read, the key matters I would just want to highlight today is just, again, affirming the airport's role as strategic infrastructure, not only for Napier District, but Hawke's Bay region, and ensuring that the district plan provides for the airport's operational and functional needs. And recognising that a full district plan review is actually a really unique opportunity to get the plan right. That only happens once every 10 years, sometimes even less frequently than that. So I think it's a really key opportunity to make sure that we're reflecting reality and making sure that mapping and provisions are fit for purpose. Yeah, so we're both happy to take your questions.
Okay, thank you very much. Just in terms of the view shaft, so I think the key thing that came out of my reading of your evidence was proposing to sort of avoid having view shafts through, should I say, the centre of the airport, you know, where the core buildings are and things like that, just to prevent sort of future issues about that, or even existing issues with the view shaft. Is that correct?
Yes, I would say it's not even to avoid an issue, it's just to avoid what in my opinion is an ineffective mechanism. As will become apparent to you when you go to drive through those roundabouts and try to identify the view shafts, that visual landscape is really cluttered. There's already a lot of built infrastructure. Those roundabouts are 100k, 80k, 50k approaches. So you're typically not going at a speed where you can think, oh, which hill am I looking at? Like I just don't think that the proposed view shafts are effective for protecting views of those significant features. And so based on the landscape evidence that the airport has provided, although where in the submission the airport has suggested that Napier City might want to adopt those alternative view shafts, but the position of the airport is neutral in that regard, just leaving that to the discretion of the panel. But with regard to the proposed view shafts, which transect the airport's view is to have those deleted as they don't particularly serve a purpose. And in addition to the view shafts themselves not being particularly useful, I consider that they're superfluous in terms of the provisions of the airport chapter. The airport chapter already includes a number of standards which control height, height in relation to boundary, site coverage, those matters which would effectively protect landscape amenity, or landscape views, I should say, rather than amenity.
Okay, thank you. My only other one, and it's a minor point, is around this whole issue about, I don't know if you heard the hearing yesterday, I had a chance to see it, but it's this minor issue around headlights, traffic lights and things. He said can't find it at the moment. And I put the question to the reporting officer that, I mean, often, particularly car lights, are an issue in terms of resource consent hearings and things. It's often raised as an issue. So I'm thinking, again, what is the harm of saying in the policy sense and the rule sense that things like car lights, railway lights and things are permitted?
I think the concern from the airport's perspective was that obviously airplanes obviously have their own safety lighting, and the concern is that it adds an additional layer of regulation to an activity which is better regulated under transport legislation rather than the district plan. In terms of, I guess, I don't understand the point of a permitted rule if there's no resource consent for when it's not permitted, or if you're not able to define what's okay and what's not. Yeah, and I think, as I understand it, in terms of sections like 9, 10, etc. of the RMA, to me, I don't understand exactly where car lights fit in with that regime. That's something I would have to go away and have a look at a bit closer, but yeah.
I understand. Okay, thank you. Any questions from the panel?
No, probably more just a comment. Thank you, Alan. Just, we're getting some reasonably frequent feedback just about the interaction between, specific district-wide matters and special purpose zones. And so it's not just the airport, and obviously, the intention is that certainly no final decisions are made before everything's heard. We'll be looking at how we manage that. And just really wanted to confirm, I think you said you did in your written evidence that you're okay with the amendments to the signs about sign provisions around the fronting of state highways. Is that right?
Yes,
Yeah.
correct.
Okay.
And just in that regard, the airport has a designation for airport activities, which also includes some conditions on signage.
Yep.
And the airport's worked with NZTA to develop those conditions. So recognising that the sign chapter would relate to non-airport activities and airport safety signs, etc., would be covered by the designation.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, happy. Thank you, Alan.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for attending today.
Cool, thank you.
We will take morning tea break at the moment and resume at 10:50 when we have Ravensdown attending online. So the hearing is adjourned until 10:50. Thank you very much.